The way you've learned to organize the fretboard makes it harder to play jazz. And even if you know all the scales and arpeggios, you know how the moment you have to solo, it's all gone. So in this video, I'm going to show you a 3-layer system that organizes scales and arpeggios so that you can actually use them when you solo. And once you do, you'll be able to see the licks that you want to play directly on the fretboard. There are many ways to see and organize the notes on the neck, mostly split between note names and thinking in intervals. But just knowing the intervals or note names doesn't tell you what you actually need when you're improvising. And another thing is that we can't think every note or interval that we play while we're soloing. Nobody does that. So we need to be able to think in groups of notes instead. Let's keep this really practical. To begin with, I'll just use a C major 7 chord as an example. Jazz solos follow the chords, so we need to see the chord tones first. Let's start with the C major 7 arpeggio in this area of the neck. That's the first layer. And the layer under this is the scale that the chord is found in, the notes around the arpeggio. In this case, the C major scale. That's the second layer. But in jazz, we also use the notes that aren't in the scale, so the chromatic notes are the third layer. Like this, you end up with 3 layers. Layer 1, chord tones, completely safe, directly connected to the chord. Layer 2, scale notes, pretty safe and often beautiful extensions. Layer 3, chromatic notes. Now these need to resolve, but they're also how you add forward motion and energy to your solos. Think of it like 3 colors. Each one tells you something different about how safe that note is to land on and how it relates to the harmony. Here's how it sounds. Let's start with just the chord tones. And now we can add some notes from the scale as well. And finally, throw in some chromatic notes, which is really a huge part of the jazz sound. This last lick also gives you a hint at how you want to practice arpeggios, but we'll get back to that later. Now, if you want to explore these licks and exercises at your own pace, there's a free PDF in the video description. I've written out all the examples so that you can easily start building a more practical overview of the fretboard. Now first, let's look at how this works across chords, because that's a big part of what this way of seeing the fretboard makes easier. Soloing over chord progressions is where things really begin to come together. Let's take a basic 2-5-1 in the key of C major. For this, we need chord tones, so let's just keep it really simple and add a 1-octave arpeggio for each chord. You might know these arpeggios as full positions that cover all the strings, and that is of course useful too, but here we're using 1-octave shapes because they're easier to see inside the scale and they're more practical for building jazz phrases. The thing to remember here is that these arpeggios are all in the same scale, so the C major scale sits around all of them. Your fretboard visualization is already tying information together. Now add the scale notes around each arpeggio and play through the progression like this exercise. With this, you can start mixing scale notes and arpeggios to get a line like this. And adding chromatic notes creates more tension, but also more satisfying resolutions. This sounds like real jazz, and that's the layers working together. Chord tones, scale notes and chromatic motion, all flowing through the changes. Now having a practical way to create jazz lines and play real jazz solos is also what I teach students in my roadmap course. A step-by-step process for learning to improvise real jazz lines on an actual standard without spending hours searching YouTube trying to piece it all together. There's a link in the description if you want to check it out. But like this, we're still seeing single notes, and that's not really how you want to think when you play. When I'm playing phrases like this, it's impossible to think every note in the solo. In fact, I rarely think about notes at all. It's more about having groups of notes that sound good, small chunks that you can put together to create a line. Now the first chunk you want to learn to see is probably the 1-octave diatonic arpeggios. The arpeggios are of course a direct link to the chords, and the reason to see these notes grouped together is that they're incredibly common in jazz solos. Check out how Joe Pass is playing 1-octave arpeggios all over the place in this solo. It is one of the most common building blocks in jazz, and seeing that as one thing makes it a lot easier to use them. Check out this C major 7 lick. You can see the C major 7 arpeggio and the chromatic run. And then you get another arpeggio. And that's an E minor 7 arpeggio. Now, E minor 7 sounds great on C major 7 because E minor 7 contains 3 chord tones of C major 7 plus the D. So C major is C, E, G, and B. And E minor 7 is E, G, B. And then we get the D in there as well, which is an added 9th on top of the chord. So that's the arpeggio from the 3rd. And using a related chords arpeggio to outline a richer sound is a great way to create some interesting colors in your solos. Now obviously it's a lot easier to just think C major 7 and E minor 7 instead of thinking each individual note. So C, E, G, B and E, G, B, D. So you want to see those shapes on the neck as well, not just the basic C major 7 chord tones. This same arpeggio from the 3rd concept works for the other chords as well. So in this next example, I'm using F major 7 over the D minor 7 chord, which of course is the arpeggio from the 3rd of D minor 7. But there's also another chunk that is easier to see than to think. So you have the F major 7 arpeggio over D minor 7, and a few bars later you have the E minor 7 over C major 7. Now both arpeggios are great examples of using the arpeggio from the 3rd, but check out the first part of this line. Now this is an enclosure. It's where you approach a target note from below and from above, before landing on the target note. In this case, that's the F, the 3rd of D minor 7. And again, this is a phrase that you can choose to see as one thing together rather than thinking through every note, especially since this is a mix of chromatic and diatonic notes. So E, G, G flat, E, F, that's much too complicated. And if you think of it like that, then it can be moved to other chords as well. So here it is over a G7. It's the same phrase, it's just moved up to the D, and then I'm just playing or seeing exactly the same thing around the D, the 5th of G7. Now another option is to bleed into the phrase with an arpeggio, as I'm doing here on C major 7. You can even use it and move out of the position before coming back, as I'm doing here enclosing the D on D minor 7. Remember that you can get the PDF for all these examples and start exploring how to use this approach in your own playing. Use the link in the description. So that's the system. You see the notes on the neck as 3 layers: chord tones, scale notes and chromatic notes. And then you use that to stop thinking in individual notes and start seeing chunks that you actually want to play in your solos. So arpeggios, enclosures and other good phrases. Things you use in your solos, things that sound good on the chord. That's how a jazz player actually navigates the fretboard in real time. But you also need to find those good chunks or licks that you want to use in your solos. And a great place to find solid vocabulary is Barry Harris. Now this video is on one of his exercises that gradually helps you turn scales into jazz licks directly on the song that you're learning. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.